All the way out west in Ghana, where the International Monetary Fund says it is optimistic that Accra and its bilateral creditors can reach an agreement on how to restructure over $5 billion worth of bilateral debt. Now, such an outcome would pave the way for another $600 million disbursement from the IMF to the West African country. According to the IMF's resident representative for Ghana, discussions between Ghanaian authorities and the official creditor committee, which is co-chaired by France and China, is showing promising progress. Ghana defaulted on most of its external debt in late 2022, and it needs to secure restructuring agreements with official creditors, international bondholders and other commercial lenders in order to successfully implement an IMF loan deal and emerge from its worst economic crisis in a generation. All right, then let's get you some analysis on this story. Gabriel Nagatu is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Africa Centers, joining us now live on the program. Gabriel, it's always good to see you on the program tonight. So let's start with a broad picture here. Does Ghana have specific targets in this restructuring program? Is a primary goal here to free up as much liquidity as it can in the short term, or to have a meaningful reduction in principal?
Well, thank you. I think it's the latter. What Ghana is trying to do is two things. One is reach macroeconomic stability and bring its debt to a sustainable level. So by freeing up some liquidity. So it's not so much about reducing the debt stock at this point, at least. I mean, eventually that is the target. But at this point, the idea is to restructure with a view to bring the debt to a sustainable level, because right now it is not sustainable, and along the process bring about macroeconomic stability in the Ghanaian economy. So these are the two key objectives of this round of efforts.
We've seen Zambia and Ethiopia run into a problem where the official creditor committee essentially rejects the proposed restructuring terms for Eurobond holders, right? Because of that phrase that we often hear in these sort of things, you know, comparability of treatment. But these are two very different kinds of creditors. So how can Ghana avoid falling into the exact same problem? And the idea that I have in mind here is, you know, even if you're talking about restructuring company debt, right? Different creditors will be treated differently. You wouldn't treat a supplier in the same way that you treat a bondholder, for example.
Yeah, this I think is the conundrum that most countries are now beginning to face, this equitable treatment of all lenders. As in the case of Ethiopia, where the country was able to negotiate a fairly substantial amount of its debt through the G20 framework and so on, and then only to go to the Eurobond lenders who did not want to join that group. And the terms of the reduction in the debt restructuring with the creditors committee was that all debtors would be treated equally. So in the face of a Eurobond lending group that refuses to participate in that structure, Ethiopia, I suspect, had no option but to do sort of a managed default that defaulted only on the Eurobond and not on its entire debt. So this was sort of a managed thing. Now, Ghana may be able to structure its debt currently with in the domestic market, and I think this is what this round is aimed at. Restructuring debt in the domestic market. When it comes to the international lenders, this is an issue that Ghana will have to deal with. And as I said, this issue of equitable treatment of all lenders may be something that other African countries may go the way of Ethiopia. This, of course, will have significant impact on future borrowing and credit worthiness, but you are not left with too many options. As in the case of Ethiopia, there was a much larger debt at stake by not following the equitable treatment principle, and by treating the Eurobond debtors separately and as a privileged group. So the Ethiopians, in the end, I think, decided to do a managed default specifically on the Eurobond and not the entire stock of debt. And Ghana may be forced to look at these options going forward.
Do you think that's something that, because now we've run into that problem with Zambia, we've run into the same problem with Ethiopia, do we need to change the terms rather around equitable treatment, and I'm using that phrase very loosely here, under the G20 common framework? Because clearly, we can't treat people who are essentially Eurobond holders, they expect, there's certain things that they're not willing to take on. That bilateral lenders might be able to take on. Bilateral lenders might be able to say, yeah, it's okay, we'll wait for 5 years. That's not something that a Eurobond holder will be able to say because, for them, they're saying, look, we've already planned for this cash flow to come through over the next 3 years, over the next 5 years. I can give you a maturity extension, but I can't essentially just waive that payment for the next 2-3 years.
Well, I think this is something that we're going to see more of, and perhaps it is a role for the IMF to look at the G20 and say, can we have a discussion about not making this a conditionality for getting debt reduction under the G20 framework? Because, as you said, if you are a Eurobond lender, it's my money, your money, and it's, there's pension funds and so on. And individuals and institutions are not interested in these issues. So countries are between a rock and a hard place where they need to borrow, and Eurobond, particularly in the future, is very unlikely to be lending to African countries who are going to turn around and say, we'll treat you equitably with everyone else. And the other side, bilateral lenders, concessional lenders, and so on, who operate under different operating modus operandi. So this is a negotiation that has to take place because on one hand, you have the G20, on the other hand, you have the commercial lenders, and African countries are sort of caught between these two in the middle, and I would imagine this is the role, like for an institution like the fund, to get between these two and say, okay, how do we manage this? Who gets paid first, who's subordinated, who comes later? Because this equitable treatment requires everyone, every lender, commercial and non-commercial, to be treated the same way. And it sort of negates the loan agreement, as it were, in the strict legal sense. So there's a need for some tweaking of the agreements in that sense.
All right, then let's talk about downside risk as we wrap up the conversation. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, Ghana doesn't have a term sheet and an agreement in place with bilateral creditors, at least by the end of February. What happens next? Can it still get that $600 million disbursement from the IMF without having an MOU in place?
I think once Ghana is able to negotiate with the domestic banks, largely this round, and get an agreement, then that should lead to an MOU. And that MOU is required for the IMF to release the next tranche of payment, about $600 million, which would be, critically helpful in terms of, again, reducing the debt to a sustainable level and creating some form of macro stability. So Ghana, if it completes the ongoing negotiation with the domestic lenders, and if it completes the negotiation with the fund on some of the restructuring and some of the policy reforms that need to take place, I think we'll be online to secure out of the 300 billion, the next 600 odd million payment shortly thereafter. So the MOU should be forthcoming immediately thereafter.